Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
I never imagined walking through the front door of my own home could feel like stepping into a trap I had been blind to for months. Yet there I was, suitcase in hand, heart pounding from the exhaustion of a grueling overseas assignment that had demanded every ounce of my energy, every shred of courage I could muster. And the constant awareness that one wrong decision could have ended me in a way no one would ever forgive themselves for, only to find my entire world had shifted without my knowledge while I was out risking my life for a project that had been more than just work. It had been everything I believed could secure our future, everything I thought I was doing for the people who were supposed to love and respect me above all else. The house smelled familiar, but the warmth I had expected was absent, replaced by a tension I could feel in my bones before I even saw them, before my eyes landed on Jason and Mark together in the living room, acting as if nothing had happened. As if the months I had poured into keeping us afloat, keeping us safe, and keeping myself sane had been a prelude to watching the people I trusted most redefine the meaning of betrayal right in front of me. My stomach dropped, my hands shook, and I had to lean against the doorframe just to keep from collapsing, because this was not the kind of situation you prepared for. No matter how strong you thought you were, no matter how much you thought you knew the people you called family. Because the truth, when it hits like a freight train, is impossible to dodge, and the truth in that moment was that my own brother had taken the one person I thought I could trust the most in the world, the one person I believed was my partner in every sense of the word, and reduced our shared life to nothing more than a secret I had somehow failed to uncover. I remember standing there, frozen, watching them laugh at some inside joke that suddenly felt cruelly amplified by my presence, and wondering how I had been so blind, how the months of absence, the countless nights spent working in conditions that would have broken anyone else, the endless calls home that I thought were connecting us had been nothing more than a distraction while they conspired against me in the most intimate way possible, while my parents, who I had assumed would side with me, had apparently chosen to ignore the truth in favor of keeping the illusion of family intact, and the realization hit me in waves so strong that for a moment I considered walking away without saying a word, leaving them to their own choices, letting them live with the consequences of the decisions they had made without me, because the anger I felt was so raw, so unfiltered, that it demanded more than just tears. It demanded acknowledgement. It demanded a plan. It demanded that I recognize the moment for what it was, the end of everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and trust. I had always believed that family was unshakable, that blood was stronger than mistakes, that parents would see past petty conflicts when the people they loved most were being hurt, but the sight of Ruth and Daniel standing awkwardly by, attempting to maintain composure, attempting to offer the usual platitudes about forgiveness and keeping the family together, made it painfully clear that their definition of family included choosing their favorite child over the one who had sacrificed everything for them, choosing comfort and convenience over loyalty, and in that instant, I understood that I could not rely on them, that I could not expect them to understand the depth of my pain, and that if I were to survive this without losing myself, I would have to face it alone. I said nothing at first, because words, in that moment, felt inadequate, and I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble, refused to give them the kind of reaction that would make them feel justified in their choices, and instead, I let my silence carry the weight of everything I could not yet articulate, letting it sit heavy in the room as if to underline the enormity of their betrayal, and, while they shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that I could only interpret as guilt or perhaps relief that I had not exploded, I began to formulate the first steps of what I knew had to be done if I was going to reclaim even a fraction of the life they had attempted to take from me. I reached for my phone, not to call anyone, not to cry to friends, but to gather evidence, to document the messages, the interactions, the subtle hints that had been there all along but that I had overlooked in my trust and in my exhaustion. And as I typed out notes, screenshots, and reminders to myself, a strange sense of clarity washed over me, sharper and colder than any emotion I had felt in weeks, because I realized that knowledge, information, and timing would be my first weapons, the tools with which I would regain control over a situation that had spiraled so far out of my hands, and I allowed myself the briefest flicker of satisfaction knowing that while they thought they had destroyed me, they had actually only motivated a version of me they had never met, one that was calculating, patient, and unwilling to surrender to the chaos they had created. By the time my parents had finished insisting, in their familiar tones, that it was time to forgive and that family meant more than mistakes, I had made my decision, calmly, quietly, without raising my voice or shedding another tear, and I knew that my words, when I chose to speak them, would carry a finality that no argument, no apology, no guilt trip could ever erase, and in the meantime, as I sat alone in the room that had been mine for years, surrounded by the ghosts of what I thought my life would be, I began plotting the course that would allow me not just to survive this betrayal, but to turn it into a victory that they would never see coming, because the first act of revenge, I decided, would not be loud or public, it would be quiet, precise, and devastating in its inevitability, and I would start by learning everything about the people who had betrayed me while making sure they never suspected the storm that was quietly gathering just beyond their perception. I looked at them one last time that night, at the faces I had once loved and trusted beyond reason, and I allowed myself a single thought, sharp and unyielding. This is where family ended, and I would be the one to decide what came next. I returned to my apartment that night, exhausted, emotionally raw, and painfully aware that my life had shifted on its axis in a way I could never have anticipated, and as I closed the door behind me, I realized that the world I had once trusted, the people I had devoted myself to, and the future I had meticulously built for myself had all been quietly hijacked by the very individuals I had believed would stand beside me no matter what. And I understood in that moment that the only way forward was to reclaim control without allowing them the satisfaction of seeing me break, to act with precision and patience while they remained oblivious to the storm that was slowly gathering just beyond their awareness. I spent the following days carefully observing, maintaining a routine that appeared normal while internally cataloging every slip, every inconsistency, and every betrayal that had gone unnoticed while I was away. Because I knew that rushing headlong into confrontation would only play into their hands, that anger displayed openly could be twisted into justification for their actions, and that the only way to achieve true recompense was to watch silently, gather evidence, and prepare a strategy that would not only restore my sense of power but would also expose the weaknesses in the lives of those who had tried to destroy me. And as I reviewed messages between Jason and Mark, subtle hints of manipulation and control emerged. Evidence that Mark's devotion had faltered not just because of temptation, but because of calculated interference, because of a plan I had been blind to until now, and the depth of the deception I had endured struck me with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and a grim satisfaction that finally, I could begin to act with clarity. I kept in touch with a few colleagues from abroad under the guise of professional correspondence, but in reality I was seeking opportunities that could give me leverage, ways to create financial independence that would not only secure my future, but would also allow me to act decisively without hesitation, and while they believed I was retreating into a period of recovery, I was meticulously laying the foundation for the first moves of my revenge, establishing networks, arranging resources, and quietly ensuring that when the time came to confront the betrayal, I would do so from a position of undeniable strength. And the knowledge that every step they had taken to undermine me had only fueled my determination became a driving force that transformed my grief into a focused, controlled energy that I had never experienced before. A force that whispered that patience would be far more effective than impulsive outrage, and that every piece of evidence I collected would eventually converge. 2. Tip the balance in my favor. My parents, oblivious to the depth of my observation, continued their insistence on family unity, pressing for calls, visits, and explanations that I provided in measured tones, never revealing the storm inside, never allowing my voice to betray the strategic calm that had settled over me, and in each interaction, I subtly tested them, probing to understand how far their loyalty to Jason and Mark extended, carefully noting the inconsistencies in their rationalizations and realizing that their commitment to preserving appearances over truth would eventually become a vulnerability I could exploit. Because people who choose comfort over honesty underestimate the power of someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain by acting with precision and resolve. I began to make small, calculated moves, reaching out to mutual friends, leaving anonymous tips that hinted at the truth without exposing my involvement, allowing whispers of Jason's manipulations and Mark's unreliability to circulate quietly. A methodical erosion of their credibility that left them unaware until the consequences became unavoidable. And while my parents remained determined to enforce a superficial peace, the foundations beneath their carefully constructed illusions were beginning to crack in ways they would not recognize until it was far too late, and I watched these changes unfold with a detached satisfaction, knowing that every revelation, every doubt sown in their minds, would serve the greater purpose of reclaiming not only what had been taken from me, but also the dignity and autonomy that had been denied by their choices. During this period, I also allowed myself to reflect on what I had learned about Mark, about Jason, and about the parents who had prioritized one child over another, and as the days passed, I realized that the anger that had once threatened to consume me could now be channeled into strategy, that every perceived weakness, every lapse in judgment, could be leveraged, and that by remaining patient, by observing from a distance and maintaining the appearance of disengagement, I could orchestrate a series of actions that would shift the balance entirely, leaving them exposed in ways they could not anticipate, and the quiet empowerment that emerged from this realization became a new source of strength that reinforced the notion that in this situation, silence and observation were far more powerful than confrontation and outrage. By the end of the week, I had a comprehensive understanding of their routines, of the alliances they relied on, and of the vulnerabilities that could be exploited with minimal risk to myself. And while my parents continued to insist that forgiveness was the only path to preserving family bonds, I knew with absolute clarity that the concept of family they referenced had already been severed by their own choices, that the loyalty I had once extended without question was now a resource I would use selectively and strategically, and that the first tangible steps of my revenge would begin not with confrontation but with a careful, calculated positioning that ensured every action I took would carry maximum impact while leaving them entirely unaware of the source of the change until it was too late to respond effectively. As I sat alone one evening, reviewing the evidence I had gathered, the messages I had documented, and the observations I had recorded, I felt a quiet sense of anticipation building inside me. A recognition that while the initial shock of betrayal had threatened to shatter me, the deliberate patience I had embraced was transforming that pain into a weapon, and I knew that the first move, though subtle and unseen, would begin the process of reclaiming my life, my power, and my dignity in a manner that would ensure not only satisfaction but also the kind of quiet, undeniable triumph that comes from acting with precision, foresight, and absolute clarity of purpose. And in that moment, I allowed myself a single thought, sharp and unwavering. They had no idea what was coming, and when the time arrived, the consequences of their choices would unfold in a way that left no doubt that the person they had underestimated was not only capable of reclaiming everything they had taken but of doing so with a mastery that would leave them reeling, powerless, and fully aware that every choice they had made had led them to this inevitable reckoning. By the time I decided to act, I had already spent weeks watching, listening, and cataloging every detail that could give me an advantage, and I knew that patience alone would not be enough to regain control over the chaos that had overtaken my life. Because while Jason and Mark had been careless in assuming that my absence would render me powerless, they still possessed resources, relationships, and an illusion of dominance that needed to be dismantled with subtlety, precision, and timing that could only come from careful observation and methodical planning. So I began laying the groundwork for my first real moves, not by confronting them directly, not by expressing the rage that had simmered inside me for weeks, but by constructing a series of steps that would destabilize them in ways they could not anticipate, weaken the alliances they relied on, and position me to regain not just my own sense of control, but also the leverage necessary to ensure that every action I took from this point forward would have consequences that they would be forced to face without any ability to counteract them. I started with the people around them, identifying those whose loyalties were flexible, those who could be influenced with information delivered carefully and discreetly, and those whose admiration or dependence on Jason or Mark had made them blind to the inconsistencies in behavior that were obvious to anyone paying attention, because I understood that undermining the foundations of their relationships required subtlety. And I spent hours crafting messages, making discreet phone calls, and dropping hints in conversations that suggested there was more to the story than the public facade they projected, all while maintaining my own appearance of calm, composure, and detachment, which in itself became a powerful weapon because it prevented anyone from seeing the true extent of the plans I was putting into motion, leaving them completely unaware that the person they had dismissed as defeated was already orchestrating the first ripples of their eventual downfall. Meanwhile, I took steps to secure my own independence, realizing that financial and professional security would be crucial not just to protect myself, but also to give me the freedom to act decisively when the time came. So I began connecting with contacts I had nurtured while working abroad, exploring opportunities that could increase my influence, and quietly arranging resources that could be deployed in ways that would catch Jason, Mark, and even my parents by surprise. Because I knew that relying on anyone's goodwill at this stage would be a mistake, and I understood that the most effective form of revenge would be one that was not only strategic, but also executed with a sense of inevitability. A slow and unstoppable force that would leave them facing the consequences of their choices without ever realizing the full extent of how meticulously those consequences had been planned. As I implemented these early moves, I also paid careful attention to the emotional terrain of the situation, because undermining someone's sense of security, their belief in their own untouchability, required more than just logistical preparation. It required an understanding of psychology, of the way pride, arrogance, and fear interact, and how even small cracks in confidence can expand rapidly when exploited strategically, and so I observed their reactions to subtle cues, recorded inconsistencies, and noted patterns that could be leveraged later, all while maintaining the appearance of someone who had moved on, someone whose life had been disrupted but who had not allowed the betrayal to define her. Because I knew that appearing unaffected would disarm them, lower their defenses, and make the eventual consequences even more potent, and every detail I gathered was carefully stored, mentally filed, and integrated into the broader plan that I had begun to formulate, one step at a time, with precision and patience. I also had to manage my parents, who continued to insist that reconciliation was the only path forward, that family was about tolerance, forgiveness, and maintaining appearances. And while they believed that their words could persuade me to return to a sense of normalcy, I responded with measured calm, never revealing the depth of my observation, never allowing them to sense the strategic intent behind my actions, and in doing so, I ensured that their insistence on family unity became irrelevant, because their version of loyalty had already been compromised by their choices, and I understood that their need to preserve appearances could be used against them. That their desire to maintain the illusion of a united front could make them blind to the subtle shifts I was orchestrating, and that patience would allow these shifts to accumulate into a decisive advantage when the moment came for me to act openly. By the end of the first week of implementing these initial steps, I had already begun to see the first effects of my strategy, small, but telling signs that my influence was creating doubt, uncertainty, and subtle fractures in the world Jason and Mark had taken for granted. And while nothing had yet been revealed to them directly, the groundwork had been laid, the pieces had been positioned, and I could feel the momentum shifting in ways that were invisible to everyone but me, and in the quiet moments when I reviewed my notes, assessed my progress, and considered the potential outcomes, I understood that this was only the beginning, that the first act of revenge was as much about preparation and positioning as it was about execution, and that the true satisfaction would come not from immediate confrontation, but from the inevitability of the consequences when the carefully orchestrated plan unfolded. Sitting alone in my apartment one night, reflecting on the meticulous progress I had made, I allowed myself a brief flicker of satisfaction, knowing that the world they believed was secure and unshakable was quietly unraveling around them. That every relationship, Every assumption and every moment of arrogance they had relied upon was now vulnerable to my actions, and in that realization, I felt a surge of control. A sense of inevitability that the person they had underestimated would not just survive the betrayal, but would also reclaim power in a way that was deliberate, calculated, and emotionally resonant. And as I closed my notes, planned the next moves, and imagined the eventual reckoning, I understood that patience, strategy, and observation were more potent weapons than any outburst of anger could ever be, and that the first moves had already set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the consequences they had never imagined they would face. I knew that the most effective form of control was never to confront directly until the timing was precise and the impact unavoidable, and after weeks of careful observation, patient planning, and subtle positioning, I began to implement moves that would not only unsettle Jason and Mark but also begin to reshape the network of relationships they depended on, because I understood that their arrogance, their assumption that their betrayal had placed me permanently on the sidelines, made them blind to the slow but unstoppable consequences that were quietly closing in around them, and every action I took had to be deliberate, multi-layered, and capable of creating ripple effects that would touch multiple aspects of their lives simultaneously, leaving them scrambling to maintain the illusion of normalcy while the foundations of that very normalcy were being dismantled methodically and invisibly. I started by carefully leveraging the professional contacts I had cultivated before leaving, reaching out to individuals whose influence could quietly sway projects, decisions, and reputations, and while my communications were never overt, I made sure that the right information, selectively filtered to suggest concern or doubt, reached those who mattered, so that Jason and Mark began to face minor disruptions in their work, hesitations from collaborators, and the subtle questioning of their reliability, all without realizing that the cause of these ripples traced back to me, and as I monitored these effects, I felt a growing sense of satisfaction that came not from immediate confrontation or vengeance, but from the knowledge that every carefully planned move was systematically eroding the control they had assumed was untouchable, exposing vulnerabilities that I would later exploit for maximum impact. Meanwhile, I continued to maintain appearances in my interactions with my parents, who remained insistent that forgiveness and family loyalty were the only paths to peace, pressing for calls, visits, and discussions as if the events of the past weeks had never fundamentally altered the balance of trust and respect in our household. And while they attempted to guide me back toward reconciliation, I responded with calm, calculated words, never revealing the extent of my strategy or the precision of the actions I had set in motion, knowing that any hint of my awareness or intent could provoke defensive maneuvers that would undermine the slow build of my influence, and in each conversation, I subtly tested their allegiances, noting the ways in which they rationalized their loyalty to Jason and Mark, cataloging these rationalizations as potential leverage points for the next stages of my plan. I also began to insert myself into social situations and professional gatherings where Jason and Mark operated, presenting as someone who had moved on, someone who had regained control over her own life and circumstances, while carefully observing their behaviors, interactions, and vulnerabilities, because I knew that being present, even invisibly in a sense, allowed me to identify cracks in their confidence, patterns of overconfidence, and moments when they relied on assumptions that no longer held true. And by the end of each evening, I had detailed notes, observations, and strategies for the next steps, always calculating the ways in which subtle interventions could multiply the effects of their own miscalculations without ever revealing the full extent of my involvement until the decisive moment arrived. In parallel, I began creating situations that would trigger small but telling responses from both of them, orchestrating circumstances in which their choices, their arrogance, and their trust in flawed assumptions would lead them into minor failures, embarrassments, or complications that, when observed, provided both confirmation of my insights and a platform for further action, because I understood that the most satisfying form of revenge was one in which they remained unaware of the source of their difficulties until it was impossible to ignore, and that the accumulation of these consequences would magnify the impact of the final moves, creating a crescendo of realization and regret that would be both inescapable and entirely self-inflicted. Every message I sent, every interaction I initiated, and every observation I recorded was carefully designed to create leverage, to sow seeds of doubt, and to exploit the smallest inconsistencies in their behavior. And as I watched these effects unfold, I felt a growing sense of control, understanding that each layer of influence I built around them, each subtle disruption in their assumed stability, was a step toward reclaiming not only the dignity and security that had been taken from me, but also the moral and emotional high ground that would ensure the satisfaction of the ultimate reckoning. Because true victory lay not in impulsive confrontation, but in orchestrating circumstances so that every consequence they faced was the natural outcome of the choices they had made. As the days passed, the cracks in their world began to widen, and I noticed moments of hesitation, frustration, and uncertainty that were subtle but unmistakable, evidence that the carefully constructed illusions they had relied upon were beginning to fail. And while they continued to interact with their peers, their collaborators, and even my parents with the same air of control, I could see the beginnings of panic lurking beneath the surface, a recognition, however unconscious, that the world they had taken for granted was no longer entirely under their command, and that the cumulative effect of small, strategic actions could create a domino effect whose impact would ultimately be overwhelming and entirely deserved. By the end of this phase, I had successfully begun to close the net around them, leaving their professional credibility questioned, their social stability subtly compromised, and their private confidence shaken, all while maintaining the appearance of calm, composure, and independence that concealed the precise and deliberate orchestration of every consequence. And in that quiet space where observation, preparation, and strategic intervention intersected, I recognized that the stage had been set for the next, decisive moves, the moments when their carefully maintained illusions would collapse entirely, leaving them to confront the full impact of the choices they had made. And I allowed myself a quiet certainty that the reckoning was approaching, inevitable and complete, because in this carefully constructed network of observation, patience, and subtle action, I had not only regained control over my own life, but had also ensured that the consequences they would face were fully deserved, carefully orchestrated, and impossible to avoid. The moment I had been meticulously preparing for arrived not with a grand announcement, not with a sudden confrontation, but with the quiet and inevitable realization that the web I had spent months weaving was finally tight enough to leave Jason and Mark no space to maneuver, because every subtle shift, every carefully planted doubt, every discreet intervention into their professional and social circles had accumulated into a force that was both unstoppable and undeniable. And as I sat across from my parents at the table where they had once insisted on forgiveness and family loyalty, I understood that nothing I said or did from this point forward would be reversed or mitigated by their expectations, because their loyalty had already chosen the side of betrayal, and the consequences of that choice were now inescapable, and I could see in their eyes a flicker of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that their insistence on preserving appearances had blinded them to the inevitability of the reckoning I had orchestrated, and that recognition, even if unspoken, was its own validation of the patience, strategy, and careful planning that had brought me to this point. I began by addressing them directly, my voice calm but carrying the weight of certainty and authority that comes from knowing every detail, every misstep, and every opportunity for disruption that I had orchestrated, explaining, without anger or embellishment, the ways in which I had quietly taken control of the situation, the professional connections I had nurtured, the social dynamics I had influenced, and the subtle but decisive interventions that had begun to unravel the world Jason and Mark had assumed was secure and unassailable. And as I spoke, I could see their unease growing, the careful facades of composure they had relied on beginning to crack, because while they had assumed forgiveness could restore normalcy, they had never considered that consequences could be delivered not through punishment, but through the precise application of strategy and observation, a lesson in inevitability that I had honed to perfection over the preceding months. Once my parents were forced to absorb the reality of what had been accomplished, I shifted focus to Jason and Mark, who were not present in person but whose reputations, confidence, and credibility had been subtly, methodically, and completely undermined by actions they could neither predict nor control, because I had created situations that forced collaborators, colleagues, and friends to question their reliability, honesty, and judgment. And I had made sure that every miscalculation, every poor decision, and every assumption that had contributed to their initial arrogance became a visible, undeniable consequence that could no longer be ignored, and in the quiet spaces between interactions, I observed the ripples of uncertainty, frustration, and confusion that my orchestrated interventions had created, and I knew that the culmination of these efforts would deliver the clarity, recognition, and satisfaction I had been working toward with every calculated move. I also confronted the emotional and personal dimensions of the betrayal, because Jason had stolen not only my trust, but the intimacy I had shared with the person who had once been my partner. And while vengeance could have been delivered through confrontation or dramatic gestures, I understood that the most powerful form of justice would come from reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my sense of agency, and ensuring that the consequences of his actions were experienced fully in the collapse of the structures, relationships, and assumptions he had relied on, all while I maintained control over my own narrative, my own reputation, and my own future. Because true triumph is not measured by humiliation alone, but by the complete restoration of self in the face of deliberate harm. As the days unfolded, the outcomes of my efforts became increasingly visible. Professional opportunities that Jason had taken for granted began slipping through his fingers. Collaborations that had once been secure were questioned, and personal relationships that had been manipulated or assumed loyal revealed cracks that could not be repaired, and Mark, whose overconfidence had blinded him to the shifts around him, found himself confronting repeated obstacles and complications that were clearly beyond coincidence, and in each instance I observed, noted, and allowed the consequences to manifest fully, knowing that every setback, hesitation, or loss was a direct reflection of choices they had made. The same choices that had caused the initial betrayal and had now been met with consequences orchestrated with precision, patience, and a clarity of purpose that left no room for excuses or denial. When I finally addressed my parents again, I did so with an unwavering calm that reflected the certainty of victory, making it clear that their insistence on forgiveness and family unity no longer mattered. Because the moment they had chosen to support the betrayal, to excuse the actions of Jason and Mark, they had effectively ended the family as it had existed for me, and I would not be drawn back into dynamics that rewarded deceit, manipulation, or disloyalty, and while my words were measured, they carried the weight of finality, because I understood that clarity, decisiveness, and the assertion of boundaries were essential components of emotional justice, and that by declaring my independence from their misguided insistence on reconciliation, I was delivering a form of triumph that could not be undermined, reversed, or dismissed. By the end of the reckoning, every element of my plan had fulfilled its purpose. Jason and Mark faced the consequences of their actions in ways that were visible, undeniable, and inevitable. My parents were forced to confront the results of their misplaced loyalty, and I emerged not only intact but empowered, having transformed the betrayal into a demonstration of strategy, patience, and precision. And as I reflected on the entire process, I recognized that true satisfaction came not from anger, confrontation, or spectacle, but from the knowledge that every move had been calculated, every outcome anticipated, and every consequence deserved, and in that awareness, I felt a profound sense of closure, accomplishment, and liberation that no words or gestures could diminish, because in the end, the family they had insisted on preserving through their loyalty to betrayal had ended the moment they chose them, and I had quietly, deliberately, and brilliantly ensured that the outcome was unmistakably mine.